Before the first word was ever spoken into existence, before the stars were hung in their positions like lanterns over a sleeping world, there was already a decision made, a decree, not written in stone. Stone hadn't been invented yet, not whispered between gods. The gods hadn't yet learned to fear what a single name could do. The decree was older than language. It existed in the architecture of the universe itself, buried inside the marrow of causality, stitched into the fabric of what was permitted to breathe and what was not. And the decree said, in no uncertain terms, in the grammar of absolute divine authority, this one must never arrive. Think about that for a moment. Not that he must die young, not that he must suffer, not that his fate must be tragic or twisted or cruel. Those are mortal sentences handed down to heroes and villains alike throughout the long and bloody history of myth. No, this was something else entirely. Something colder. The gods didn't want him born, not condemned, not punished, not exiled, simply prevented from ever crossing the threshold between nothing and something, between the void and the breath. And yet, here is what makes this story different from every other tale of divine intervention, cursed bloodlines or heaven-defying births. Here is the detail that separates this from legend and drags it toward something that feels disturbingly, uncomfortably true. Every single force in the cosmos that was supposed to stop him, every omen, every seal, every divine messenger dispatched to close that door, arrived too late, or was diverted, or in one extraordinary case chose to look away. The question that has haunted scholars, mystics, and ancient storytellers for thousands of years is not how he was born. That part eventually can be explained. The question, the one that still has no clean answer, is why the gods were so afraid of him in the first place. What do you know about a man that you are? Willing to unmake the laws of nature, to erase him before he even draws his first breath. What future did they see? Stay with me. There's something that happens when you go deep enough into ancient mythology. Not the sanitized, children's book versions. Not the dramatic Hollywood retellings, but the original accounts. The ones translated from clay tablets and papyrus scrolls. The ones preserved in fragments because someone, somewhere, thought they were dangerous enough to bury and important enough to save. You start to notice patterns that don't quite make sense under a modern framework. Gods who behave less like omnipotent rulers and more like panicked bureaucrats trying to contain a crisis. Divine councils that convene not to celebrate creation, but to limit it. Edicts handed down not from a place of power, but from a place of something that looks very much like dread. This channel exists at that intersection between what ancient civilizations recorded and what they were trying to warn us about. If this is your first time here, welcome. And if you've been here before, you already know that we don't do surface-level mythology. We go all the way down. Before we continue, if this kind of deep, unfiltered dive into ancient stories moves something in you, take 5 seconds and subscribe. Hit the like button. It genuinely changes how many people get to hear these stories. And these stories, I believe, deserve to be heard. And drop a comment right now. Tell me where in the world you're watching this from. I want to know. Every single time I read those comments, I'm stunned by how far these ancient stories travel. One more thing before we go further. The story you are about to hear draws from real mythological traditions. Mesopotamian, Greco-Roman, Proto-Semitic, and several oral traditions that predate written record. Some historians treat these accounts as pure allegory. Others believe they describe something that genuinely occurred, filtered through the symbolic language of ancient cosmology. I'm not here to tell you which interpretation is correct. What I'll tell you is this: the details are too specific, too consistent across too many unconnected cultures to dismiss entirely. Make of that what you will. Now, let's go back to before the beginning. The earliest version of this story doesn't come from Greece. It doesn't come from Egypt or Rome or the Norse. Traditions most people reach for when they want gods and monsters. It comes from a place much older than all of them, from the flat, reed-covered riverlands of ancient Mesopotamia, from a civilization so old that by the time Homer was composing the Iliad, These stories had already been ancient for 2,000 years. The Sumerians called the space before creation the Abzu, the primordial deep. Not darkness exactly, because darkness implies the absence of light, and light hadn't been conceptualized yet. Not silence, because silence implies the memory of sound. The Abzu was prior. It existed before the categories we use to describe existence had been established. The gods themselves emerged from it, and they did so imperfectly. The way anything complex emerges from chaos, with residue, with leftovers, with remnants of the original formless state that hadn't been fully organized into anything useful or comprehensible. Those remnants had names. In the oldest Sumerian texts, they're listed in cuneiform in a way that suggests they weren't considered enemies, exactly, or demons in any Christian sense. They were more like problems, unresolved equations, things that the organizing principle of the universe, what the Sumerians, personified as the god Enlil, had classified, assessed, and quietly decided should not be granted the status of being. One of them was described in a text discovered in the ruins of Nippur in the late 19th century, on a tablet so damaged that scholars spent decades arguing about whether certain passages were literal or purely metaphorical. The tablet describes what can only be called a divine injunction, a formal decree, issued by the assembly of the great gods, specifically forbidding one particular essence from taking physical form. The language is extraordinary. It doesn't say this essence is evil. It doesn't say it's destructive or malicious. What the tablet says, in the careful, administrative, Sumerian that characterized their religious bureaucracy, is that this essence, if given form, would remember things that had been deliberately forgotten. Read that again. Not destroy, not conquer, not corrupt. Remember, the gods were afraid of what he would remember. The tablet breaks off at this point, and the next legible section appears to describe a period after. Something had already gone wrong, after the injunction had already failed. The tone shifts entirely. Where before the text had the dry, procedural quality of divine legislation, suddenly the language becomes almost frantic. Several gods are described as having abandoned their posts. One passage, still disputed in its translation, seems to describe a god weeping, which is not, in Sumerian cosmology, supposed to be possible. Gods in this tradition don't weep. They calculate, they rule, they punish. Weeping is a human degradation. But there it is, one of the old ones, standing at the edge of what the text calls the place where the seal was kept. And the seal is broken and there is weeping. And somewhere in the world that should never have received him, a child is taking his first breath. His name, in the oldest fragment we have, is rendered in cuneiform as a sequence that doesn't directly translate into any modern language. Scholars have approximated it as something like Enkidur Ana, though that's almost certainly a later editorial addition, borrowing the name of the god Enki to explain away the strangeness of the original. The original sequence of symbols, according to the Assyriologist Samuel Kramer, who worked with this tablet in the 1950s, doesn't correspond to any known divine or human name in the Sumerian lexicon. It's a category error. A name that uses the grammar of a divine title but applies it to something that the Sumerians' cosmology had no official category for, something that was neither god nor human, neither condemned nor elevated, simply present, breathing and remembering. What exactly he was remembering, the tablet doesn't say directly, but scattered across the rest of the legible text. There are references, oblique, almost casual, as if the scribe was trying to communicate something without stating it outright, to events that the official Sumerian mythological record claims never happened. Wars between gods that the canonical texts don't mention. A previous version of the world that was unmade before the current one was constructed. And one line, just one, that refers to what seems to be a different set of creation rules. A set of rules that, if this child remembered them and spoke them aloud, would supersede the current divine order entirely. Not overthrow it, supersede it. the way a more fundamental law supersedes a local ordinance. This is where the story shifts. Because at this point, once the gods realize what has happened, once they understand that the seal is broken and this child is breathing and recalling, their response is not what you'd expect. You'd expect fury, divine armies, immediate action. What the tablet describes instead is something far more unsettling, a period of profound, extended stillness. The gods collectively do nothing, not because they can't, because they're waiting to see what he'll do first. There's a principle buried in several ancient mythological traditions, in Mesopotamian theology, in certain Vedic texts, in pre-Olympian Greek cosmology, that says divine power, at its deepest level, operates on the logic of response rather than initiation. The gods can preemptively seal, forbid, prevent, restrict. But once something has already crossed into being, once that first breath has been taken, the rules change. Now they must react, and the moment they react, they reveal something. They reveal what they're afraid of losing. He was alive. He was aware. He was remembering. And the gods, all of them, were watching him with the careful, measured attention of creatures who knew that their next move would define something permanent about the universe. He was, at this point, perhaps 3 days old. What happened on the 4th day is where the story fractures into different traditions. And that fracturing is itself meaningful in a way I want to explore with you, because the disagreements between ancient cultures about what happened next tell us almost as much as the agreements do. The Babylonian version of this story, compiled roughly 1,000 years after the Sumerian original, layered with new theological interpretations but preserving enough of the core material that scholars can identify the lineage, introduces a figure that doesn't appear in the Nippur tablet at all. She's described as a woman, though the word used doesn't exactly mean woman in the sense we'd understand it. In Babylonian mythology, there are several categories of being that occupy the space between human and divine, and this figure seems to belong to one of those ambiguous classes. Her name is never given directly in the surviving text. She's referred to only as the one who carried him from the threshold, which, in Babylonian cosmological language, is loaded with implications. The threshold, in this tradition, is not a metaphor. It's a specific cosmological location, the boundary zone between the Abzu, that primordial, deep and in the structured world that the gods built on top of it. It's the place where the seal was located, the seal that broke. And this unnamed woman is described as having been standing at the threshold when the break occurred, not to cause it, not to exploit it, but for reasons the text doesn't explain. She was simply there at the exact moment when the forbidden essence crossed over. And she made a decision. The Babylonian text describes this decision with a verb that has no clean English equivalent, something between chose and committed and became responsible for. She didn't just carry him away from the threshold. By carrying him, she entered into a relationship with him that the Babylonian scribes considered binding at a cosmic level. In their theological framework, the act of carrying a forbidden being across the threshold and into the living world made her, in some essential and irrevocable way, not his mother, not his guardian, something with no established category, something the gods had to account for now, in addition to accounting for him. 2 problems where they'd expected one. There's a passage in this section of the Babylonian text that I want to spend a moment on, because it's the kind of detail that keeps me up at night. After describing the woman's decision, the scribe records the reaction of a divine council, a smaller group than the great assembly, something more like an executive committee that convened specifically to address the crisis. The council's deliberations are summarized in a few lines, and one of those lines reads, in the most literal translation available, Idok, they agreed that he could not be unmade, and they agreed that she could not be separated from him, and they disagreed about everything else. They disagreed about everything else. This single line, in the middle of a 3,000-year-old Babylonian theological text, carries the weight of something that feels jarringly, unexpectedly human. Divine councils in ancient mythology are almost always depicted as unified in their decisions, gods may argue, but they converge. Unanimity is the expression of divine authority. Dissent is weakness. And here, in this executive committee assembled to deal with an unprecedented cosmic crisis, the scribe records not a resolution but a deadlock. They could not agree on what to do next, which means he survived not because he was powerful enough to resist the gods. He survived because the gods couldn't agree on how to stop him. The silence at the center of their indecision was his first protection. Now I want to take you somewhere else. Not geographically, we're not leaving the ancient world, but mythologically, because there's a parallel tradition that most Western-focused mythology channels never mention, and it describes what seems to be the same figure, the same forbidden birth, the same divine crisis, from a perspective so different that at first glance it looks like a completely unrelated story. It comes from the Vedic tradition, specifically from certain passages within the Atharva Veda, the fourth and most ancient of the Vedic texts, which has always been treated with a kind of theological unease, even within Hinduism itself. The Atharva Veda contains material that the other three Vedas don't include: spells, protective charms, rituals for dealing with entities, that the more elevated cosmological framework of the Rig Veda or Upanishads doesn't formally acknowledge. Scholars have long noted that it preserves older, rougher, stranger material, the kind of thing you collect when you're trying to be comprehensive rather than systematically tidy. In one sequence of the Atharva Veda, there is a hymn 8-9, for those who want to look it up, that describes a being referred to as Skamba, the cosmic pillar, the axis around which everything else rotates. Most commentators interpret Skamba as an abstract cosmological principle, similar to the logos in later Greek thought or the Tao in Chinese philosophy. And that's probably accurate as far as it goes. But buried inside that hymn, in verses that the standard commentaries tend to gloss over quickly, there's a description of a secondary Skamba, a shadow pillar, a kind of echo that arose not from the original act of creation, but from a refusal of the original act of creation, where the primary Skamba represents the universe's willing organization into structure and law. This secondary echo represents something that should have been organized, classified and integrated, but wasn't. Something that remained stubbornly, quietly prior to the categories, prior to the laws. The hymn describes the god's awareness of this secondary echo with a Sanskrit word, adbhuta, and that translates roughly as astonishing or miraculous, but carries connotations of something more unsettling than wonder. Adbhuta is the feeling you have when you see something that the laws of your world say cannot exist, and yet exists. It's not fear exactly. It's not awe exactly. It's the specific cognitive vertigo of encountering evidence that your understanding of the rules was incomplete. The gods felt adbhuta, and the secondary Skamba, this echo, this prior thing, is described in several verses as having been born. Not created, not formed, born, in the biological, temporal, irreversible sense of the word. As if something as fundamental as a cosmic principle had been condensed into a singular, physical, mortal but not quite mortal form. A man who was the echo, who carried in his body the memory of what existed before the rules were written. The Vedic text doesn't tell us what happened to him. It's a hymn, not a narrative. It circles rather than progresses. But the emotional register of those verses, the careful, almost nervous language the Vedic poets use when they approach the subject, communicates something clearly, even across the translation barrier. This was not a comfortable topic. This was not a story the tradition wanted to tell directly. They told it sideways, in a hymn about something else, because the direct version was too much. What was the direct version? What happened to the man who carried the pre-law inside his body? What did the gods ultimately do when their divine council's deadlock finally broke? I need to tell you about a man named Utnapishtim now. You may know him by a different name. The Babylonians called him Utnapishtim. The Hebrews absorbed a version of his story into the figure of Noah. The Greeks had their Deucalion. He's the flood survivor, the man who was made immortal, the one who exists at the far end of the world, beyond the waters of death. Almost every tradition that has a flood myth has a version of this figure. And for centuries, the scholarly conversation about him has focused on the flood itself, on the universal human memory of catastrophic inundation, on the archaeology of sea level changes, on the cultural function of survival narratives. But there's something odd about Utnapishtim that the flood narrative tends to overshadow. He was, by every theological measure of his tradition, not supposed to be immortal. Immortality in Mesopotamian mythology is not simply an extended lifespan, it's a cosmological status, a category of being. You don't stumble into it. You don't inherit it. It is granted by the assembly of the great gods, and it is granted essentially never, because the entire Mesopotamian cosmological project was built on the principle that humans are mortal by design. Mortality is not a punishment. In this tradition, not a consequence of a fall from grace. As in later theological frameworks, mortality is a feature. It's what makes humans useful to the gods. It's what keeps the system organized. Utnapishtim's immortality is therefore a problem of the same kind as the forbidden birth we've been following. And here's the detail that most retellings leave out. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, our primary source for Utnapishtim's story, when Gilgamesh finally reaches him at the ends of the earth and asks directly how he came to be immortal, Utnapishtim's answer is strange. He doesn't describe the flood as the reason. He describes the flood as the occasion, the circumstance that was used to justify a decision that the gods had been delaying for an entirely different reason. He was given immortality, he says, not because he survived. Many people survive things. He was given immortality because not giving it to him had become more dangerous than giving it. Why? Because he knew something. He'd been told something by the god Ea, the god of wisdom, the god who consistently throughout Mesopotamian mythology functions as the system's most elegant, subversive, that he was not supposed to know something about the original plan, something about the world before the flood, and why the flood had been ordered, and what its real purpose was beyond the surface narrative of divine anger at human noise. And the knowledge was dangerous, not because Utnapishtim might use it as a weapon, but because he might speak it, might tell it to someone, might pass it to Gilgamesh, who would pass it to whoever came after. So they put him at the ends of the earth, beyond the waters of death, where no living person could easily reach him. They made him immortal so that he would be his own monument, so that the knowledge would be preserved in a form that was simultaneously impossible to destroy and impossible to deploy. They imprisoned him in endless life, and when Gilgamesh, after his impossible journey, finally sat across from Utnapishtim and asked him the real question, not how did you survive, not how can I become immortal too, but the question underneath those questions, the question Gilgamesh couldn't fully articulate because he wasn't sure it was permitted to ask. Utnapishtim looked at him for a long time, and then he told him about a plant at the bottom of the ocean that restores youth, a distraction, a consolation prize, a story designed to send Gilgamesh home empty-handed but satisfied enough not to press further. The real answer Utnapishtim didn't give, couldn't give. The real answer was the thing he'd been turned into a monument to protect. And that thing, that knowledge at the bottom of Utnapishtim's silence, connects, in ways I don't think are coincidental, back to the forbidden child on the Nippur tablet, back to the secondary scumber in the Atharva Veda, back to the woman who carried something across the threshold and became cosmologically responsible for it. They're all pointing at the same shape in the dark, a truth that the gods decided should not circulate. A man born to remember it, a universe that rearranged itself, not once but repeatedly, across multiple traditions and thousands of years of independent mythological development, to try to contain what he carried. And let me tell you what the Greek tradition does with this. Because the Greeks, characteristically, are the most explicit. They don't bury the crisis in administrative cuneiform or sideways hymns. They dramatize it, they name names. They give the gods dialogue and motivation and recognizable human-scale emotions, which makes their version both the most accessible and, in certain ways, the most misleading. The theatricality of Greek myth can make you think you understand something that you're actually only watching. The figure who maps most cleanly onto our forbidden child in the Greek tradition is not who you'd expect. It's not Heracles, whose divine birth was feared for straightforward reasons of power. It's not Dionysus, though Dionysus's story has significant structural overlaps. The figure I'm thinking of is far less frequently discussed in popular mythology, and I suspect that's partly because his story is one of the more genuinely disturbing ones in the entire canon. His name is Melinoe. Wait, before you reach for your mythology encyclopedia, let me acknowledge, yes, Melinoe is described in some sources as female. The gender in the ancient sources is actually ambiguous and contested, and several scholars of Orphic tradition argue that Melinoe represents a theological principle that transcends binary categories entirely, which is consistent, actually, with what we've been tracking across the other traditions. Beings who don't fit the established categories, whose existence represents a failure or a refusal of the cosmic filing system. Melinoe appears in the Orphic Hymns, a collection of religious texts from the ancient Greek mystery traditions that are substantially older and stranger than the Homeric epics, and considerably less well-known. The Orphic tradition operated alongside mainstream Greek religion the way a deep current runs beneath a river's visible surface. Present, influential, never quite mainstream. The Orphic hymns are addressed to a series of divine figures, many of whom don't appear in Homer or Hesiod at all, which is itself significant. They're addressing gods, or God-adjacent, beings that the canonical tradition didn't officially acknowledge. Melinoe's hymn is, by any standard, extraordinary. The hymn describes Melinoe as being born in a cave beside the Cocytus, the river of lamentation in the underworld, from a union between Persephone and Zeus. But here's the theological problem the hymn doesn't try to hide. Zeus, in this union, took the form of Hades. He disguised himself as the Lord of the dead to approach Persephone, which means Melinoe was conceived in a deception that violated the fundamental ontological distinction in Greek cosmology between the living and the dead, between the above world and the underworld, between Zeus's domain and Hades's domain. She was born at the crossing point of categories that were never supposed to touch. Her physical description in the hymn is one of the most viscerally strange in all of ancient Greek religious literature. She's described as being half white and half black, not in any racial sense, but in the sense of existing simultaneously in two mutually exclusive states of being. She carries both the pallor of death and the warmth of life. She can't be fully present in either realm. She moves through the world of the living and the world of the dead with equal disorientation, because she belongs fully to neither. And her purpose, like the function attributed to her in the Orphic tradition, is to carry the madness of the dead into the minds of the living, not as punishment, not as a malicious act, simply because she can't help it, because her existence is itself a kind of membrane between states that were meant to be separated, and wherever she goes, the separation becomes incomplete. The dead leak into the living, the forgotten presses against the remembered, the things that were supposed to stay buried in the underworld of the mind, in whatever you want to call the place where we put the things we can't process, start rising. She makes people remember what they were supposed to forget. Sound familiar? There it is again, the same forbidden function, translated into Greek, theological language. The same reason the gods tried to prevent the birth Not because this being would destroy anything, not because they would conquer anything, because they would make the forgetting impossible. And in the Orphic tradition, Melinoe is not condemned, is not imprisoned, is not destroyed. She simply wanders perpetually, restlessly, neither alive nor dead, neither punished nor at peace. The gods don't know what to do with her. The Orphic hymn ends not with resolution, but with an appeal. The worshipper asks Melinoe to be kind to them, to bring only gentle dreams, to let the membrane be permeable just enough, and not more than that. Please, let us remember just enough. Don't make us remember everything. Because if we remembered everything, if the full weight of what was forgotten pressed through the membrane, all at once, and something in the structure of what we've built, on top of the forgetting, would give way. That's what the gods knew. That's why they tried to prevent the birth. That's why the divine council deadlocked, why Utnapishtim was imprisoned in immortality, why the Vedic poets approached the secondary skamba only sideways, in a hymn about something else. The forbidden child was not a weapon. The forbidden child was a key. And now I want to take you somewhere you might not expect this story to go. Because there's a tradition that sits at the edges of recorded mythology, not Sumerian, not Greek, not Vedic, but woven through all of them in strange ways, that addresses directly the question we've been circling. Not who was this forbidden being, not what did they carry, but what happened after, what came of the birth that was never supposed to happen, what the world looks like now in the aftermath of a seal that couldn't hold. This tradition comes from a set of Aramaic texts discovered in the Cairo Geniza in the late 19th century, a repository of thousands of Jewish manuscript fragments preserved in a Cairo synagogue storeroom for close to 1,000 years. Most of these fragments are liturgical, prayers, legal documents, biblical texts, but a significant number of them contain material from traditions that mainstream Judaism had classified as heterodox or simply too strange to canonize. Magical papyri, incantation bowls, and what scholars call agadic materials, story traditions, that circle around the edges of the official theological narrative. One of these fragments, preserved in poor condition, partially damaged by moisture, describes what can only be called a birth narrative, not for any figure named in the canonical tradition, for a figure referred to throughout the text only as Haben Shiloh Haya, Zarik Lihyut in Hebrew, the son who was not supposed to exist. The narrative begins, characteristically, not with the figure himself, but with the reaction to his existence. A council of angels in which, in Second Temple Jewish cosmology, maps functionally onto the divine councils of the older Mesopotamian tradition, debates what to do about a birth that has already occurred. The language of the fragment is damaged at this point, but two distinct positions are legible. One faction argues for immediate removal, a word that implies germination but uses a theological vocabulary that carefully avoids explicitly saying it. The other faction argues for observation, watching, waiting to see what the child does, because the rules that would normally apply to such a case have been complicated by the manner of the birth. The nature of the complication isn't described directly, but the text refers to something the child's mother did or was at the moment of his birth. And the word used to describe her is malachit usizi distismistisin, a feminine form that could mean messenger, an angel, or something in the much stranger third category that Second Temple mysticism used for beings who cross between the divine and human spheres. She was between, and so, because she was between, the child born from her was between, and beings who are between cannot be handled by rules designed for beings who are one thing or another. You can't terminate what is simultaneously permitted and forbidden. You can't elevate what is simultaneously divine and human. The categories collapse, and what you're left with is a being who exists in the failure of the filing system, not triumphant, not tragic, just there, occupying a space the cosmos didn't formally account for. The fragment ends with something that struck me. When I first read the scholarly summary of it, as almost unbearably poignant. After the council's deliberation, after the two factions failed to reach consensus, after all the theological maneuvering and category management and divine bureaucracy, the text describes the child himself, perhaps a few years old now, not performing miracles, not speaking forbidden knowledge, not fulfilling any cosmic destiny. He is playing. Specifically, he is building something in the dirt with small stones, arranging them. The text says, into shapes that have no name in any language, not symbols of destruction, not ciphers for forbidden knowledge, just shapes. Shapes that please him. Shapes that seem to him, in the way things seem to small children, correct. And the angel assigned to observe him, one of the watching faction, careful and dutiful and thoroughly unsettled, sends a report back to the council. The report contains one line that the fragment preserves intact, unblemished by moisture or time, as if something in the physical survival of the manuscript understood this line mattered. The report says, he does not know what he is. He doesn't know what he is. And in the silence that followed, in the divine council chamber, in the margins of the ancient text, in the distance between then and now, that was not reassuring. Because a child who doesn't yet know what he is a child who might one day find out. What happens when he does? What does a being born to remember the forgotten laws of a prior world do with that remembering? Once the remembering becomes conscious, what does a man do when he finally understands that his existence is itself a question? The cosmos hasn't answered? That the gods who tried to prevent his birth are still somewhere watching? That the seal they tried to place on, whatever he carries inside, him has never fully reformed? Does he become what they feared? Does he become something else entirely? Does he simply live, playing with stones, building unnamed shapes in the dirt, carrying the weight of a cosmic secret he was never told, but somehow always knew, moving through a world built on forgetting with the quiet, unshakable awareness that somewhere underneath all of it, something is trying to be remembered? The ancient traditions don't give us a clean ending to this story. And I think that's intentional. I think the scribes who preserved these fragments across all these cultures and centuries understood something that our modern mythology has largely forgotten. The most dangerous stories are not the ones with endings. The most dangerous stories are the ones that keep going, that keep finding new vessels, new languages, new fragments to be preserved in new storerooms, waiting for the right hands to open them. The forbidden child was born. He is still, in some form, breathing. And somewhere, in a tradition we haven't discovered yet, in a tablet still buried under the earth of a city that no one has excavated, he is doing something. The gods are still watching, and they still can't agree on what to do.